Today's story comes from a small town in the heart of Texas. A chilling tale that will send shivers down your spine, as told by a young girl. It all began as the sun set and an eerie feeling settled over the place. The girl felt as though she was about to taste death itself, and that sense of impending doom was just the start. As evening approached, my heartbeat quickened. It felt as if I was on the brink of something terrible, like facing death while still alive. It wasn't easy to shake off that feeling. I was sitting on the porch, clutching my head, when suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped in fright and turned to see my mother standing behind me, tears in her eyes. "Jake, you're taking a huge risk," she said in a shaky voice. I took a deep breath and tried to calm her. "Mom, don't worry," I assured her. But hearing this, she came closer, wrapped her arms around me and began to sob uncontrollably. "I'm scared," she cried. "If anything happens to you, I'll never forgive myself." Truth be told, I was scared too. What I was about to do wasn't some small task, it was huge, and the entire town was abuzz because the village chief had even put out a large reward for it. But why was the chief so intent on this? That's what I couldn't understand. Our small town in Texas was underdeveloped, and my father worked daily wage jobs to support us. I was just 15 years old and a student in the 10th grade at our rundown public school. I was known as the bravest in my class and feared nothing, or so I thought. The part of Texas we lived in was rural, with green fields and a quaint country school that had seen better days. Behind our school was an old cemetery, dating back to before America's independence. The cemetery had long been abandoned and was rarely visited. From the second floor of our crumbling school building, the cemetery was clearly visible, and our classroom overlooked it. Every time I gazed at that cemetery, a strange curiosity took over me. I longed to explore it, but a heavy, rusted lock always barred the way. I didn't understand why I was so fascinated with the cemetery. Many times, I suggested to my friends that we should venture there, but they were too scared. "Just hearing the word cemetery gives us chills," they'd say. But for some reason, that place kept drawing me in. Little did I know that something would soon happen that would shake me to my core, and that the cemetery would play a central role. Just a few days ago, the town's most prominent figure, Mr. Adams, lost his daughter, and the news sent shockwaves through the entire community. She was only 18 years old, beautiful and healthy. How could she just die so suddenly? No one could understand it. Mr. Adams' house was only a few doors away from ours, so when we heard wails and cries that night, we knew something terrible had happened. My mom left her dinner and hurried to the front door, clutching her chest in fear. "Oh God, what could be happening at the Adams house?" she whispered. I dropped my plate and followed her outside. Many of our neighbors were already on their porches, doors wide open, listening to the cries echoing through the street. My mother asked a neighbor what had happened, but she didn't know either. "Let's go to the Adams," Mom said. When they reached the house, Mrs. Adams was wailing uncontrollably. "She was just sleeping in her room," she sobbed. "I went to wake her for dinner and she was gone." Such an unexpected death of a young girl left the whole town bewildered. No fever, no sickness, nothing. How could she just die? It was a huge question mark, shrouded in mystery. Inside the house, Mr. Adams was sitting on a chair, head bowed, holding his head in his hands. He was completely silent. My father and I stepped inside, and my father placed a hand on Mr. Adams' shoulder. When he lifted his head, his eyes were bloodshot, but oddly, not a single tear fell. His silence filled the room with an uneasy tension. Seeing Mr. Adams so lost in his own world gave me an eerie feeling. I couldn't shake the thought that there was more to this than just a sudden death. Perhaps there was a dark secret behind it. I forgot to mention, even as a kid, I was always the curious type, the one who needed to get to the bottom of things. Whenever something strange happened in our town, people would move on within days, but not me. I would obsess over it until I uncovered the truth. And now, the red eyes of Mr. Adams raised so many questions in my mind. Zara, Mr. Adams' only daughter, was the pride of his life. We had never heard anything bad about her in our town. She was a cheerful, lively girl, and no one could think anything negative about her character. Mr. Adams's house was the most well-built and the tallest in our poor neighborhood. It was the only house with air conditioning. The rest of us lived in simple, brick-and-mortar homes. Mr. Adams had quite an influence around here. Just 2 months ago, Mr. Adams had celebrated Zara's engagement, distributing sweets all over the neighborhood. My younger sister had attended the engagement party and had told me how stunning Zara looked that day. She was so happy, with no sign of any troubles. Her fiancé was well off and lived in Austin. Everything seemed perfect. So, what could have happened that led to her sudden death? But the story didn't end there. What Mr. Adams did next shocked the entire town. He made an announcement that left everyone in disbelief. When I heard the announcement from the town's preacher, I was returning from school, about to sit down for lunch. My mom had made cornbread and greens. I had just taken 2 bites when I heard the news. This version is tailored for an American audience with names and locations changed. The story's structure was preserved, but with slight modifications to flow naturally in English. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments. When the preacher's announcement echoed through the town, I completely forgot about my meal. I couldn't comprehend why Mr. Adams would make such an announcement. My mother came out of the kitchen into the courtyard. "Did you hear that announcement?" she asked, looking pale. "Yes, Mom, I heard it," I replied. She shook her head in disbelief. "Has Mr. Adams lost his mind, saying such things?" I shrugged. "I think his daughter's death has made him crazy. No one in their right mind would do this." "Seems like it," my mother agreed. But the news was so strange that soon our neighbors were knocking on our door. Mom went outside to speak with them. Our next-door neighbor asked, "Did you hear the preacher's announcement? Has Mr. Adams gone mad?" "Seems like it," Mom replied. The whole situation made me lose my appetite. "Mom, I'm going to the church to find out what's going on. Mr. Adams should be there," I said. After all, the funeral was set for after sunset. "Yes, go quickly and let us know what's really happening," my mother urged. I left without even changing out of my school uniform and headed straight for the church. As I approached, I was stunned to see a huge crowd of men gathered inside. It seemed the entire neighborhood had rushed there, just as curious as I was. Everyone was questioning Mr. Adams, demanding to know why he had made such a bizarre announcement. But he refused to explain, simply repeating that he would only reveal the reason to the person who agreed to spend the night in the grave with his daughter. And for that, he was willing to pay a hefty sum. It was an unusual and eerie proposition. Our entire town was struggling with poverty, and only Mr. Adams was wealthy. The rest of us worked as laborers, plumbers, or other odd jobs to make ends meet. Hearing about the large amount of money, the eyes of many young men lit up. Some of them were unemployed and had been searching for ways to start a business or find stable work. But when Mr. Adams said he would bury his daughter in the old cemetery outside of town, many of them looked uneasy. An elderly man spoke up. "That cemetery has been closed for years. No one has been buried there for a long time." Mr. Adams simply replied, "I will bury my daughter there, and whoever spends the night with her will be richly rewarded." The amount was so large that greed crept into everyone's hearts, thinking of how life-changing it could be. But the idea of spending a night in a grave with a corpse was terrifying. The real question on everyone's mind was, why didn't Mr. Adams want to leave his daughter alone? What was he hoping to see or discover? These thoughts raced through my head, fueling my curiosity. When I first saw Mr. Adams' red eyes earlier, I had sensed something was wrong, and now my restlessness grew. I began to wonder if I should take the risk myself. Mr. Adams set a deadline. Let me know by afternoon who is willing to do this. The burial will take place in Theald Cemetery after sunset. Many young men wavered, some saying yes, then no. But gradually, everyone returned to their homes. I, too, went back and explained everything to my mother. She was just as baffled. Who in their right mind does such a thing? No one will take that risk. It's too dangerous. Mom, what if I do it? I suggested hesitantly. The look she gave me could have burned holes through stone. Don't you dare, Jake. I swear, if you even think about it. But Mom, I pleaded, Dad's business isn't doing well. We're struggling. If I get this money, Dad could start a proper business and I could go to the city to finish my education. You'll do that if you're alive, won't you? She snapped. No, Jake, I won't let you do this. At that moment, we heard a knock on the door. Maybe it's your father, Mom said. She opened the door to find my father wiping the sweat from his forehead with a cloth. He stepped inside, looking exhausted and defeated. What's wrong? Mom asked nervously. Here, have a glass of cold water. She rushed to the clay pot, poured some water, and handed it to him. He drank it in one gulp and then sighed deeply, wiping the tears that had started to form in his eyes. I sat beside him. Dad, what happened? Nothing, he replied. I've been lifting bricks and stones all day, trying to earn enough to buy some flour and ghee for the next few days. But just when I was heading back, I realized my pocket had a hole in it. All the money was gone. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find it. It broke my heart to see the tears in his eyes. It was $500. I thought I'd buy flour with half and ghee with the rest to get us through the week. Now, we don't even have anything for tonight's meal. Don't worry, Dad. We'll make do with water if we have to, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I signaled Mom to give Dad the leftover bread, as I hadn't been able to eat much myself. Mom served him the food, but he was clearly distraught. Who knows when I'll get work again, he muttered between bites, his voice heavy with despair. Seeing my father in such pain made up my mind. I decided I would spend the night in the grave with Mr. Adams' daughter. At least this way, my father wouldn't have to suffer like this. The money could change our lives. I could complete my studies and Dad could start a business. But convincing my mother was the real challenge. Mom, I'm doing this for us, I insisted. Are you crazy, Jake? We'll starve together if we have to, but I won't let you bury yourself alive, she cried. You're my only son. I pleaded and begged until finally, in a fit of anger, she said, Fine. Do whatever you want, but I'm not agreeing to this. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I had already made up my mind. I rushed out of the house and went to Mr. Adams' place. His courtyard was filled with women reciting prayers for his daughter, whose lifeless body lay shrouded. Mr. Adams' wife was sobbing, while the women around her tried to console her. Jake, what are you doing here? Get out, one of the women snapped. I need to speak with Mr. Adams, I replied. She looked at me in shock. About what? I'm ready to spend the night in the grave with his daughter. Her eyes widened. Are you out of your mind? Do you want to die in there? I'll be fine. Where's Mr. Adams? I insisted. His wife, having overheard the conversation, stopped crying and approached me. Are you serious, Jake? Why would you do this? I need the money, I said firmly. You could suffocate in that grave, she warned. That's a risk I'm willing to take, I replied. I didn't know that Mr. Adams was standing behind the door, having heard everything. He stepped forward. Are you saying this with a clear mind? He asked, looking into my eyes. Yes, I am, I responded confidently. Think it over. You'll have to spend the entire night in there, and you'll have to tell me everything that happens, he said. Fine, I agreed, not knowing why I had just made such a huge commitment. Mr. Adams placed a hand on my shoulder, gripping it tightly, then led me to the church. Pastor, he announced, this 15-year-old boy is willing to spend the night in the grave with my daughter. The pastor's face paled, his eyes glaring at me. Have you lost your mind, son? No, Pastor, I am ready to do this, I replied calmly. A hush fell over the crowd. Many young men looked at me in shock, some even turning as pale as sheets. The thought of what lay ahead chilled me to the bone, but I couldn't back down now. The decision had been made. Hearing my words, he grew even more anxious. He kept signaling with his hands for me not to go into the grave, but I ignored him. I couldn't see anything in front of me except my father's helplessness. By now, the entire neighborhood knew that I would be buried alongside Mr. Adams' daughter and would be taken out in the morning. Everyone was worried. When I returned home, my father was also glaring at me angrily. Why did you agree to this? He asked. Because I can't stand to see you cry and struggle, I replied. Nothing will happen to me, Dad. I made a promise, and I won't go back on my word. My father fell silent, but my mother continued to sob. Jake, if something happens to you, I won't survive either, she cried. Nothing will happen to me, I reassured her. Mr. Adams said he'd make sure there's a way for me to breathe. I won't suffocate. But why is he doing this? What does he want to see? She demanded. I don't know, Mom. Whatever happens, we'll find out, I replied. She shook her head, looking deeply unsettled. This just doesn't feel right. You shouldn't have agreed to his terms. Well, it's too late now. We'll see what happens, I said, trying to sound confident. But inside, I was just as curious and scared as she was. Why did Mr. Adams want this so badly? As sunset approached, an inexplicable fear washed over me. My mother was still crying softly, and a sense of dread filled the air. I felt like my strength was draining away, so I stepped outside to clear my head. I thought to myself, I should go to the church now. The evening prayer would soon begin, and after that the funeral. The mere thought of it made me shiver with fear. As I was walking towards the church, someone suddenly grabbed my hand and pulled me into a side alley. I was startled and turned to see it was the same young man who had been signaling for me not to go into the grave. Come with me, he said, his voice tense. Who are you? I demanded, but he didn't answer. He simply dragged me into a deserted alleyway. Have you lost your mind? He hissed. You don't know the truth. I'm telling you, don't go into that grave. Why not? I snapped. Who are you to stop me? I'm just trying to look out for you, he replied urgently. If you go into that grave, you won't come out alive. That's for God to decide, I replied. I've already made my promise and I won't break it. You're crazy, he exclaimed. Listen, I knew Mr. Adams' daughter well, he began, but then trailed off, his eyes dropping to the ground. What do you mean? I pressed. What are you trying to say? I can't tell you, he stammered, his voice breaking. Either tell me the truth or get out of my way, I said firmly. Look, he whispered, glancing around nervously. As soon as she's buried, divine punishment will begin. You have no idea what you're getting into. How can you say that? She might have been a good person, I protested. Then why does Mr. Adams want someone to stay with her in the grave? He shot back. He knows what his daughter did, and he fears for her soul. I was growing frustrated. Tell me exactly what you're talking about, I demanded. The young man hesitated. She wasn't as pure as you think, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. How would you know? I challenged. Because I loved her, he confessed, his eyes dropping to the ground again. Then why didn't you propose to her? I asked, bewildered. I tried, he replied, his voice trembling. But she betrayed me, she changed. What she did, I can't even speak of it. But I know that in the grave she will face punishment. And I don't want you to suffer alongside her. For some reason, I felt a mix of disbelief and uncertainty. Part of me wanted to believe him, while another part suspected he was lying. His face was drenched with sweat, and his expression grew increasingly frantic. I pulled my hand away from his grasp and walked towards the church. A large crowd had gathered there. The evening prayer was offered, and then the funeral prayers began. My heart was pounding louder than ever. Throughout the ceremony, the young man kept signaling to me not to go into the grave, but I had made up my mind. As the prayers ended, they lifted the body and headed towards the old cemetery behind our school. Many people were visibly scared. There were countless stories about that graveyard, tales of screams and wails heard at night, which had always kept people away. No one understood why Mr. Adams insisted on burying his daughter there. But tonight, I was about to find out the answers to all the questions. As we moved towards the cemetery, the crowd grew nervous. Many young men turned back, too afraid to venture further. Yet they all wanted to witness what would happen to me in that grave. Fear gripped my heart as we neared the cemetery. My mother's tear-streaked face flashed before my eyes, pleading, "Jake, come back. We don't need the money." I saw my father's broken expression, recalling how he had lost his wages, worrying about when he'd find work again. Tears welled up in my eyes as I thought about my parents, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to go through with this, for my family's sake. As soon as the lock on the old cemetery gate was opened, the gravedigger spoke up again. "Mr. Adams, I urge you once more, don't put your daughter through this test. People say they hear screams from here at night." Mr. Adams remained firm. "It doesn't matter. I still want to bury my daughter here." The gravedigger sighed and shrugged his shoulders. "You'll need to make the grave wider," he added, glancing curiously at Mr. Adams. "Why?" he asked. "Because this boy is going to spend the night in the grave with my daughter," Mr. Adams replied, gesturing towards me, "and we'll dig him out in the morning." The gravedigger's eyes widened in shock. "What are you saying? How can I bury a living 15-year-old boy alongside a dead girl?" he exclaimed. Mr. Adams remained calm. "You all know how hard things have been for Frank," he said, referring to my father. "He hasn't been getting any work and he's struggling. That's why his son agreed to this. But think about it," the gravedigger pleaded. "This isn't right. God has placed a veil over the afterlife for a reason. No living person should try to uncover the secrets of the grave. This is blasphemy." Mr. Adams shook his head. "If the boy has no objection, and I have no objection, then neither should you. I've made up my mind." People tried to reason with Mr. Adams, but he wouldn't budge. In the end, the gravedigger went ahead and dug the grave. Mr. Adams signaled for me to get in. I lay down, and he brought out an expensive pipe, placing it near my face. "Keep this pipe close to your nose and mouth," he instructed. The pipe was wide enough to allow me to breathe comfortably. "You'll have no trouble breathing this way," he assured me. I closed my eyes as I lay in the grave. The cemetery was overgrown, with bushes and thorny branches covering the tombstones. It had probably been closed for many years. The gravedigger led the way, while the rest of the group followed with the coffin. Eventually, they stopped near a centuries-old grave. "This grave is over 100 years old," the gravedigger said, "so I'll dig it up and reuse it. Besides, all the graves here are ancient. If we cleared them with a bulldozer, maybe they could be reused, but nobody comes here because of the screams they hear at night." I could hear whispers around me as people discussed my fate. "We think the boy will die," one of them said, "and the sin will be on Mr. Adams' head." "Why would it be on my head?" Mr. Adams shot back. "The boy is doing this of his own free will. I didn't force him." An argument broke out as people debated whether they should dig me out of the grave right then and there. "If the boy has no objection, then neither should we," Mr. Adams insisted. "We should leave the cemetery now and return in the morning to dig up the grave. I believe he will come out alive." With that, people gradually left, their footsteps fading away into the distance. Silence settled over the cemetery, broken only by the frantic beating of my heart. The air was flowing into the grave through the pipe, but a suffocating fear was gripping me. I began to doubt myself. What if that young man was right about the girl's character? What if divine punishment descended upon her and me? Stories of the grave's torment, told to me by preachers and my parents, ran through my mind. How the grave would tighten around the body of a wicked soul. Was I going against divine law by doing this? Suddenly, I felt an urge to scream for help, to shout, "Save me!" in hopes that someone would hear me. But fear paralyzed my throat, and I couldn't make a sound. My mind was racing with thoughts of doom. Then something happened that I could never have imagined. I felt a cold presence beside me, as if the girl lying next to me had come back to life. My heart almost stopped. It felt like I was being pulled upward alongside her body. Terror gripped me. My body was soaked in sweat, and I thought I might suffocate. Then I heard voices, 2 men whispering. "Quick, pull her up," one of them said. My mind went blank. How was it possible? I turned to see the girl's body being dragged upward through the earth. I couldn't comprehend how someone could be entering this grave from another. A few moments later, I saw a large hole above me with torchlight shining through it. I moved the pipe away from my mouth and climbed towards the hole, using my elbows to propel myself forward. After a short while, I saw 2 beams of bright light and felt a gust of fresh air entering the grave. It looked like a hole had been dug nearby, and they were pulling the girl's body out. I emerged from the grave and looked up, stunned by what I saw. 3 men stood there. One of them held a torch, while another, glaring at me furiously, was the same young man who had warned me not to enter the grave. "So, this is what you're up to," I said, trembling. He smirked. "Since you found out our secret, you'd better promise to keep quiet if you want to live." "What secret?" I demanded. "We bring young dead girls here," he confessed, "and violate their bodies. No one comes near this cemetery because of the screams they hear at night. But that's not due to ghosts. It's us." My blood ran cold. "You're monsters," I shouted. "This is a sin, and you will face divine punishment." "Save your preaching," he sneered. "Now, will you keep this a secret, or do we need to bury you here for good?" Before I could respond, I quickly pulled my phone from my pocket. Earlier, Mr. Adams had handed it to me, saying, "Whatever happens, message me." I typed a quick message to Mr. Adams and hit send. Within minutes, Mr. Adams and the local police arrived, arresting the men. "I had my suspicions," Mr. Adams said grimly. "That's why I wanted to expose these evil men. One of them worked at a local shop, tricking girls into eating a spiked treat, promising good fortune. The girl who ate it would become unconscious, and they would commit their vile acts." The men were taken away, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Mr. Adams handed me a sum of money, more than enough to continue my education.